You know how humans are inherently kind and peaceful and never do anything wrong? Yeah, me neither. Let's be real. Most of y'all are probably complete psychos. But trust me, compared to the people I'm going to talk about right now, you're just a bunch of angels. These are the most evil human experiments of all time. Number 1, Watson's Little Albert experiment. Back in 1920, John Watson, along with one of his friends, Rosalie Rayner, decided to conduct an experiment on a 9-month-old baby they nicknamed Albert B. Sounds good so far, right? Well, strap in, because it only gets worse from here. You see, these students from Johns Hopkins University wanted to prove a little theory they had. This was that human beings are all born as blank slates that can be shaped. And what better way to do that than to conduct weird experiments on a newborn? So they took a baby from a wet nurse who worked at the hospital, paying her a whole $1 for her trouble. Can you imagine what that conversation was like? Yeah, so we'd like to conduct an experiment on your newborn that could completely mess him up for life and possibly even result in his death. No, that sounds horrible. Why would I ever do that? Did I mention we'll pay you a whole $1? Where do I sign up? Anyway, the researchers introduced the baby to a small, furry white rat to see if he'd be scared of it. Surprise, surprise, babies could see a ghost and think it's just a friend trying to play with them. And so, little Albert barely showed any interest at all. This is when the researchers decided to turn things up a notch and would play a loud sound every time they showed Albert the rat. They'd continue this over and over again, with the noises getting louder and more startling every time. Of course, this led to Albert developing a fear of the rat because he knew every time he'd see one, some annoying scientist in a lab coat was going to start remixing the worst album of all time. Sadly, the experiment led to a pretty terrible outcome for Albert. Not only did he stay fearing every furry animal, like dogs and monkeys, but even when there was no sound, he'd immediately start panicking. And the worst part, the poor kid only lived up to 6 years old, and is said to have been behaviorally and neurologically impaired for most of his life. Like, he never even learned to talk or walk. He also passed away from a bacterial meningitis infection, which some horrifyingly theorized might have been given to him during the experiment. Sheesh. I love science and all, but straight up killing a 9-year-old is where I draw the line. But there are plenty more evil experiments to talk about. Number 2. Aversion Project in South Africa. This experiment was from the apartheid era in South Africa. Turns out, as bad as living under state-regulated racial segregation is, it can always get worse. Because you could be living under segregation while also being a member of the LGBTQ+ community. You see, the South African government had some seriously strict anti-homosexual laws. Racists are also homophobes. Who would have thought? If you were gay in apartheid-era South Africa, you were considered a deviant. They considered homosexuality to be a mental illness and conducted something called aversion therapy to cure it. And yes, that's cure between two very big quotation marks. Between 1969 and 1987, the military hospital in Pretoria drugged up homosexual men and women, making them go through electroconvulsion behavior therapy when shown same-sex stimuli. And yes, that's as bad as it sounds. Basically, they'd force you to look at some, let's just say, naughty pictures, and if your body reacted at all to them, they'd try to literally zap the gay away. Unsurprisingly, this didn't work. So the crazy scientists conducting these experiments went ahead and started doing hormone therapy on their subjects, and in some cases even going far as chemical castration. There are records of about 900 men and women even undergoing gender reassignment surgery at the time, in an effort to try and reorient them. But of course, none of this worked because you can't just change your sexuality for shits and giggles. Thankfully, things have changed in South Africa since then, but boy, what a terrible time to be alive. Number 3, the Milgram shock experiments. What's with crazy scientists and trying to shock everything they touch? Seriously. Somehow, the leading thought in the medical world for the past century was to just zap the subject until they're cured or the subject dies. Either way, the problem is fixed, right? But funnily enough, the Milgram shock experiment didn't actually involve any shocks at all. That's just straight up false advertising. Conducted during the 1960s, on the surface, this Yale study was all about learning and memory training. Basically, some Americans were recruited as teachers while others were selected to be learners. Here's the neat part. The learners were just hired actors pretending to go along with the experiment. But just what was the experiment all about? Well, the learners, who, keep in mind, were just actors playing pretend, had to go over some word matching quizzes. They had to get these completely right, because on the other end were the teachers who would shock the learners every time they made a mistake. And these weren't just friendly little sparks either. Oh no, these could go all the way up from 15 to 450 possible volts. Can you imagine getting tortured because you couldn't solve your math homework? Not gonna lie, I might have tried harder in school if that was the case. But anyway, here's the big twist. This wasn't a study about learning or memory at all. Dun dun dun. Nope. Instead, it is all about authority. You see, Stanley Milgram, who conducted the experiment, wanted to see if he could actually just get people to do what he wanted just because he's the higher authority figure. Obviously, shocking people is bad for them. But would you do it just because a researcher told you to do so? Well, that's what the experiment wanted to figure out. And shocker, most people ended up pressing the lever to go to the highest voltage just because the experimenter told them to. While no actual shocks were given and the learners getting zapped were just actors pretending, it still goes to show that if given the chance, most people would choose to be straight up evil AF. Number 4, Tuskegee syphilis study. Imagine being told that you've been selected to be part of a group of individuals who will benefit from a public healthcare project for African Americans in the rural South. That probably sounds like the opportunity of a lifetime. But oops, turns out it was all a sham to do vile experiments on you. Yeah, that's kind of what happened to these poor dudes. Back in 1929, when the Great Depression hit, much of America was completely rocked by it. And a lot of healthcare projects, like one in Macon County, Alabama, were on the verge of being closed down due to a lack of funds. But, of course, some mustache-twirling villain of a scientist had a thought. Why waste perfectly good test subjects? So instead of providing the enrolled black men with the healthcare they were promised, these guys were used to study the effects of untreated syphilis. Think about that for a sec. You signed up to get cured for a disease, and the scientists are just out there, watching you die while chanting R.I.P. Bozo. And the worst part? Even after penicillin came out, serving as the go-to treatment for the infection, these subjects were never given the help they needed to overcome their infections. And despite people talking about how this whole thing is like a page out of a comical villain's playbook, the study somehow continued all the way up until 1972. That's decades of suffering inflicted on people. And I'm guessing saying, "It's just a prank, bro," at the end of all of it didn't cut it. Number 5, Stanford prison experiment. Lost all your hope in humanity yet? No? Well, you're about to. That's because the Stanford prison experiment pretty much just goes to show that if you put humans in a position where they can abuse power, well, then they're damn well gonna do it. Conducted in 1971 by a team of researchers at Stanford University, this experiment included a bunch of undergraduate volunteers who played the role of both guards and prisoners in a mock prison. Sounds good so far, right? I mean, it's just make-believe. How bad could things even get? Well, the answer to that is really, really wrong. You see, both the prisoners and the guards adjusted to the roles pretty quickly, and things got out of hand. Almost 1/3 of the guards decided they were going to take their roles a bit too seriously, conducting almost sadistic behaviors on some of the prisoners. Keep in mind, these were all undergraduate students, so it's not like they were actually prisoners who'd done terrible stuff themselves. So it'd be like if Bob from calculus suddenly started asking you to do some seriously inhumane stuff, all the while texting you to send the answers to this week's homework. It's said that pretty soon, the prisoners were emotionally traumatized, and 2 of them had to even be removed early because of how bad things got. And as antisocial behavior from the subjects continued to get worse and worse, the researchers decided to just call the experiment off, terminating it entirely. Must have been a really awkward next day in class, that's for sure. Number 6, Nazi medical experiments. Let's be real, nothing involving the Nazis has ever been good. And certainly not anything involving Nazi medical experiments. During World War II, these guys basically reached a whole new level of low for the human race, doing just about the worst things imaginable. I'm talking about stuff like abuse, mutilation, starvation, torture, the works. Most of these horrible acts were conducted on the poor folks who found themselves in the Buchenwald and Sachsenhausen concentration camps. Jews who were subjected to these experiments were told that if they helped the military, they'd be given medical and pharmaceutical benefits. But of course, you can't really take the Nazis at the word, can you? Some of the studies from the time were done on hypothermia, with researchers trying to find out what would happen to people immersed in freezing cold water. Now, I'm no expert, but even I know that's not going to lead to anything good. But it gets even worse. Some subjects were only allowed to drink seawater to figure out if pilots could survive on it if they got stranded. Unsurprisingly, these subjects died of dehydration. Subjects were thrown in decompression chambers to see the impact of high altitudes on the body. This was followed by a brain dissection on the living just so the effects could be studied in real time. The Nazis really didn't leave any stone unturned, going as far as to purposely infect subjects with poisons and infections to study their impacts. It's one thing to just outright kill someone, but torturing them and studying them in such horrific ways is just beyond insane. Really makes you think, dang, those Nazi fellas were full-fledged psychos. No wonder nobody supports them nowadays. Oh, some people still do? WTF, people. WTF. In any case, from Watson's little Albert experiment to the Nazi medical experiments conducted during World War II, those were just some of the most evil human experiments of all time. Got any other experiments you'd like to share? Let me know in the comments. And as always, like, subscribe, and smash that notification bell.